I'm starting off with something that is in such small print, but that is because, can we just enlarge this a bit? She was one of the narrators in my thesis. And basically, this is the story of a woman. The caste is middle caste, landed caste. And she was positive. When I met her, she was in an adoption agency to give up the baby that was going to be born. Her husband died of HIV. She was positive. The son, older son, who was now 13, her husband died 10 years ago, was HIV negative. The in-law kept her in the house largely because of the son, largely because of the guilt that their son had given her HIV. Now, 10 years later, she had a sexual relationship with her paternal cousin, who in many castes of rural Maharashtra can be the husband also. The Bua's son, father, sister's son, is actually the intended bridegroom in many castes in Maharashtra. And if you don't marry there, then somebody thinks something is wrong with you because you had to go and search for a bridegroom or a bride beyond this, the two kinships supplying daughters to the other. So she had a sexual relation with a cousin like that. He was drunk once and forgot to use a condom and she got pregnant. Now the in-law threw her out. So they're not questioning the sexuality of the son who gave her HIV. The paternal aunt said that she was framing her son because it was a family feud. And the cousin said, I could have married you, but actually you are married earlier. Yeah, so a woman cannot marry again, but if he had been married, he could have just married her as a second or a half wife. And so now, she couldn't access abortion because she couldn't tell her parents that she was pregnant for a long time. And then finally her mother brought her to the adoption agency. So she was giving up this child. She called this, she didn't call it a child, and of course it was still only a fetus. But she kept saying, when she said my child, she meant the child at home. And she said, I'm giving up this one up so that I can go and claim my child. As though any court of law was going to give her that child when she was positive and when she had completely disgraced families at both ends. So this is what it was. This is Veena's story, and I think that actually tells us a lot about what intersectionality and what the complex matrix of domination is. So if I can go. Okay, now I'm here as I'm a fake researcher in even like Charvak, though I don't believe in rebirth. This is one of my previous lives, so I only have very selective memories about health research. So here is when we did some work on abortion. We found that it was quite dynamic. Donna Badian at that time had talked of quality of care, and she had talked of what were the quality care indicators. But we found that everything changed based on the context. So who used the public sector? When did they use the private sector? People did it very selectively. For chronic illnesses, they used the public sector. For acute illnesses, they used the private sector. For deliveries, they used the private sector because they were treated badly in the public sector. But everything was put aside for abortion. So they didn't want a service that was very close by because it was confidentiality. And they gave up a lot of aspects of quality of care just so that they could remain confidential. Yeah? So just changing what kind of service you want and how it is located, like Goffman would say, because there is stigma attached to one thing, there will be stigma attached to another. Now look at, these are just examples, and I'm going to go through the slide really quickly. Look at how the two-child norm affects rights of women. And which women does it affect? It affects the poorest, it affects the Dalits, it affects Muslims. And we know that Sama study in Rajasthan shows how a woman who was elected head of a village had a third child, and they said you had to now give up that because you have a third child. The child died, and then they said you kill the child because you wanted to have power. So that's the way that you pull the rug under the feet of somebody who has been in power for the first time because Dalit reservation. So a Dalit woman comes to power, but that's how you take it out. On the contrary, a male sarpanch in another village who had a third child said, she hasn't been living with me for so many years, so that child is not even mine. Yeah, so see how gender, caste, class, all these intersect. So this two-child norm takes away maternity benefits as though the third child doesn't need maternal and paternal care. Political participation, but that is in Panchayati Raj institutions. So it's the poorest, that's the place you will take away political participation based on number of children. Subsidize food through the public distribution system, as though suddenly when you have a third child you become rich. You don't need, and I fully agree with what Imrana ji said now. The moment you target a program, the moment you say health or food is going to be only for the poorest. Now, look at how we've been asked to give us subsidy to, LPG so that they can gas around, the whole world and talk about, how developed we are. But the moment you allow any program to be targeted in the name of poor or women or whatever, it means that that program is going to limp. It means that the poorest, when they are sickest, are going to be standing in a queue when they are going to be able to ask and demand the least. And you saw, I was, completely had goosebumps when Guru sir spoke about how a certain touch can increase value and how a certain touch can decrease the value of a person. And that's the queue that's standing there. So all our earlier uncles and aunts who had surgeries in public hospitals because they were the best places in the city are now the worst places. And only in some moment of declassing I've gone and stayed in public hospitals, but I don't know whether I would have the courage, honestly have the courage now to get myself admitted for a week or 10 days in a big public hospital. So this is how it's gendered. Now look at contraception, how it's coerced in certain situations, but socio-culturally for women outside of marriage, it's not available. So the context changes. The abortion is itself, and the campaign related to sex determination now has become largely it's getting into an anti-abortion campaign. So look at the connections. Now intersectionality, this is something in India what we call the double triple burden. If you remember the 70s, the politics of the 70s and the 80s, we call this the double and triple burden, or we call that double and triple oppression. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw was going to be here, but we've been working for a whole year, but she's had to have a surgery, and so Kim couldn't be here for this meeting. When Kimberly Crenshaw talks about intersectionality, she's not really talking of the additions, but she's talking of the subtractions. She's talking of exclusion. So she's using intersectionality and exclusion, and I'll just take the dot point 3. I don't like to use the word bullet, sorry, so I use the word dots. The third dot point here is that the black woman bleeding to death. She uses a metaphor of a black woman who is bleeding to death at an intersection, but no ambulance will pick her up because she says, unless specified, the women's movement is white, and unless specified, the black movement is male. Yeah? And so the women's movement won't pick her up because she's black. The black movement won't pick her up because she's a woman. Somebody else won't pick up because they're not working for the poor. Somebody might say, is she poor? But here is a woman lying, bleeding to death, but nobody is going to take her to the hospital. And by the time they have the whole discussion of who might be able to pick her up, this woman is going to die. And that's the way that she uses actually the whole concept of intersectionality. So she says, she and many others, Shields and Sundari and Rakhal and others have done a wonderful collection of many articles even last year and even this year, and I would encourage all of us to read those. So it's the study of intersections between different groups of minorities, and specifically that of interactions of multiple systems of oppression or of discrimination. And this multidimensional categorization helps us to understand how social hierarchies are created through differentiation at multiple sites. And I'll come to Patricia Hill Collins in the next slide in the complex matrix of domination. Now, Crenshaw asked this question in the light of as a black feminist. So is Patricia Hill Collins also a black feminist, and she asked this very interesting question: when white women mapping the margins, that's like her seminal work of 1990-91. And Crenshaw asked the question to white women and says, why should we be part of your anti-rape movement? Just give us one reason why we should be part of that movement. Our women have been raped for centuries. And there was no movement to say what happened to the rape of those women. Now suddenly you want us to participate unless without you discussing race. And don't you even understand that now post-slavery, it's possible for a black man and a white woman to have an alliance and not be physically lynched, though Rizwan Noor is killed. Maharashtra, the eyes of Dalit boys are gouged. I mean, it's how clearly can you say, how dare you look at our women when you gouge out the eyes of a Dalit boy, a lower man who will look at an upper woman. So different kinds of lynchings will happen. So she asks white women a question and says, introspect a little bit. Don't you think that the rape laws are also partially to control your sexuality, so that you don't interact with people who you should not be interacting? And I think it's a very, very interesting question. So she says, unless you discuss race and unless you talk about the rape of all women, black women, I don't think should waste any energy joining your movement. But what we require maybe is another parallel movement that looks at the multiple systems of oppression. And that takes us to Patricia Hill Collins, who talks of the complex matrix of domination. Basically, what Hill Collins and a lot of other feminists are saying is that various intersections of social inequality produce a matrix of domination which is more than addition of all. So, in research, if we just add one category to another, it's not like that. There's a lock. It interlocks. And that interlocks in such a way that she talks of it as some people having to clear more roadblocks than others to reach the main road. So if I'm caught in 15 traffic jams, whereas somebody is on the main artery of the road, then that's how long I would take to reach that. And it doesn't mean that 1 and 2 and 3 traffic jams is just an addition of each other, because by the time I reach that main road, I would have lost access to a lot of things. And then she talks of the internalization of the oppressor's view that creates further oppression. So, for example, battered wives, how they would say, the husband, how he looks at them is, I'm useless, I'm worthless, I'm, worth beating, I don't have any self-respect. So self-hatred is created. Muslim women, lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender, Dalit, etc. Then the feminist standpoint, Hartsock, many other people have talked about, that it's based on the unique, experience that creates knowledge. And there is, people have taken Hill Collins and also their own scholarship and developed this further. Sharmila Rege was there. In fact, Guru sir talks to us, and he actually warns us and says that at any point, if insider wisdom is substituted by outsider knowledge, then you don't even know how to understand the system, leave alone how to dismantle it. So people have gone as far as to question outsider knowledge in those strong words. So then they talk of the outsider within, which is, say, for example, a Dalit or any subordinated woman never feeling like an insider in the movement. Yeah? They're always there, but you can come for the march but don't carry your rainbow flag for the lesbian women. Or Dalit women, we have like this one token Dalit woman, we have this one Muslim who doesn't bite. So we have we have a token of different people that makes up something. But if you see the whole hegemony and if you see the majority, it is always the Savarna and Hindu anywhere. People will ask in many organizations, why give a Sikh festival a holiday for that, or why give for say any other Indian religion, nobody celebrates that. Why? Because we don't have anyone. Now that's the first problem. Why don't you have a Sikh? Why don't you have a Muslim? Why don't you have a Dalit or a another person from another religion? So that's the first fault. And now secondly, you're not going to give, if you give religious festival holidays, then you must give for all, because you're not allowing your people ever to visit people's homes when they have their holidays. Yeah, so they're always the outsiders within. Now Hill Collins here, and I can talk about the women's movement, she says in the earlier movements, subordinated people need exclusive spaces to formulate and validate their politics. after which they can begin to influence the mainstream. Because, you know, we understand only from the oppressor's point of view. I could give one example is now the women's movement beginning to work with men all over again. In the 70s, it would have been lethal because there would always have been just a front, as many of us were, autonomous, you know, we called ourselves autonomous women's groups, but we were attached to, you know, a center-left or a left group, and we were only part of that big organization, and the hegemony was male within our organizations. The knowledge was formulated by the men. So this helps to create knowledge free from the domination of the oppressors. Then she says, in order to avoid victim-based identity politics, these exclusive spaces have to guard from becoming exclusionary. For example, women say, oh my God, men will never understand women. Yeah? Nothing makes us holy because we have a uterus, or don't have a uterus, because there's so many hysterectomies now. But you know, we have seen American women GIs, mutilate Iraqi men's dead bodies. Yeah. And so therefore now, you know, this whole notion of a universal sisterhood, whether it is after the Babri, whether it is after Shah Bano, whether it's after Rup Kanwar, whether it's after Gujarat, what happened, we know this universal sisterhood doesn't exist anymore, and we have to meet each other on multiple axes. And the struggles have to be collective and must deal with multiple oppressions. The last one, I promise you this is the last one. Now, how do we conduct public health research from this intersectional feminist standpoint, theory and methodology? That's a big mouthful, that doesn't really matter. It's more than context, okay? It's not just contextualizing, it's context and it's an addition of a different kind of knowledge, it's a different way of thinking, it's a different way of doing. In fact, it's actually a different way of being. And that is what we need if we really want to do research that's useful for people. Ethics and more are required to grapple with feminist standpoints. Hill Collins also talks of the ethics of caring, which is part of ethics. Being aware of the power of the researcher, and I don't have time to go to, give you examples of how many places when I saw power in every research that I did. I was conscious of the immense power that I held in that space, and not being discordant in your personal or professional life. And it's not postmodernist in terms of justifying cultural essentialism or relativism. Oh, it's okay for them. For me, it's a higher level of human rights. So it's not like that, but it's understanding the nuances. Learning is difficult, but unlearning is near impossible. And I think unless we're ready to unlearn into going into new ways of thinking and being, we really cannot, I don't think, we can bring out the kind of end results that Imranaji was talking to us about. And not just giving voices to subordinated groups, because that is patronizing, it's condescending, but it's giving up the spaces that we have appropriated until now. So it's actually giving back what we have taken from people. And research itself is that, I did that, but I'm not going to go into details. The last thing I want to end with is that public health research, or any research, actually offers us many sites of resistance. It liberates us because it teaches us new ways of thinking. New feminist epistemologies are evolved out of that. And if we do our research well, it's a very subversive, see how the first word that comes to your mind is a weapon, but I'm grappling, I don't want to use the word weapon, a strategy in our hands, because it can challenge systems of oppression, all systems of oppression, including patriarchies. Thank you.